Hello, welcome back to the Shifting Schools podcast. My name is Trisha Friedman, and this week I'm on my own. Jeff is out traveling and leading workshops in the beautiful state of Washington as I speak. If you'd like to keep up with some of Jeff's work, let me remind you to sign up for our Shifting Schools free weekly newsletter, where Jeff and I are continuing to provide free resources as well as some insights from speaking with educators from all around the world. Speaking of, we've got an incredible educator and researcher on the show this week. Please welcome to the show Dr. Federica Fornaciari, who's a professor, academic program director, as well as a children's book author and a research consultant. The big spotlight topic for us in our conversation is thinking about how important it is that we are leveraging an ethics-rich education in this era of generative AI. We get into the why as well as the how. And towards the end of this episode, Dr. Fornaciari talks to us about her work in looking at the way that the media depicts generative AI. And that had me thinking about what a really interesting research project it could be for students just to do a deep dive into all of the different headlines about AI and look at what our current worldview around AI is, and then talk about why. What's the motivation there? How is it tapping into our very human emotions? And what further learning do we have to do? Before we get into this week's continuation of our AI in Higher Ed series, we've got a quick word from our show sponsor.
Discover the power of acknowledgement with Libra. In a world where every staff member's dedication shapes the future, recognizing their efforts becomes our mission. Libra transforms your school into a place where achievements, big and small, are celebrated daily, creating a ripple effect of motivation and pride. Join the recognition revolution with Libra, where every achievement is a cause for celebration. For more information and a free demo, contact me at jeff@shiftingschools.com today. Looking for a place to connect with fellow educators, share ideas, and grow together? Well, welcome to Camp Shifting Schools. It's the free, vibrant community where educators like you can learn, network, and collaborate. With the fall of X, formerly Twitter, finding a trusted space is more important than ever. Join Trisha and I for exclusive courses, webinars, and Ask Me Anything sessions designed just for educators like you. Let's build a better future for education together. Visit camp.shiftingschools.com and become part of the camp community today.
And with that, please welcome to the Shifting Schools podcast, Dr. Fornaciari. Listeners, you're in for such a treat. We have Dr. Fornaciari here, and you're going to hear me refer to the doctor's incredible research and work. Please just know that you'll be able to head over to the show notes to dig into them more. And I want to start with a phrase that you wrote that has really stuck with me, and I love this phrase. Again, the link will be in the show notes, but you've written about the so-called, quote, lens of technological sublime. Can you say more, please, about what it means to take that lens and apply it to AI?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Trisha. It is a concept that fascinates me as well, actually. Let me tell for our audience a little more about what technological sublime is first, so we can set the stage a little bit. Technological sublime is deeply rooted in American culture, and it's an incredibly relevant lens to look at artificial intelligence. Originally, that term was introduced by Perry Miller in the 70s, in 1970, when he used it to refer to that almost religious reverence and awe that people feel when confronted with what we perceive to be a monumental technological advancement or a monumental technological achievement. In simple terms, the technological sublime is about that mix of awe and admiration and even fear that arises when we encounter something that is so powerful and so transformative that, in a way, it challenges our understanding of what is possible, right? Our perception of what's available out there. So this reaction is not just about the technology itself. It's about the way technology reshapes our society. It reshapes our sense of self, and in a way reshapes our future, right? So you can see how this lens could be applied to the internet, to social media, and many other technologies, obviously. So if we think about artificial intelligence, in its particularly in its more advanced forms like generative AI, this elicits obviously a deep sense of that sublime, because I believe it appears to push the boundaries of human creativity and intelligence. And I've listened to many researchers talk about intelligence here, and we could certainly have an endless ontological discussion here about what we mean by intelligence, but that would take us maybe away from our focus today. But so if we look at this lens, on one hand, there's the admiration for AI capabilities, right? The ability to analyze a large amount of data, to generate content, and to even make predictions that seem almost prescient in a way. On the other hand, there's a sense of apprehension, right? We even fear what's possible now because we wonder what these capabilities mean for our future, for the future of human labor, for the future of creativity, even for the future of identity, because many people are developing a sense of intimacy in a way with these technologies. So after Miller and David Nye, after him, expanded on the idea of technological sublime, Nye in particular highlighted how the feelings of awe and fear have historically served to bind society together in a way, offering almost a secular civil religion where technological progress takes on a almost sacred role in a way. So with AI, we are definitely witnessing a modern incarnation of this phenomenon, at least in my perspective. We see the awe-inspiring nature of AI technology. We see its ability to seemingly think, create, and decide. That obviously triggers that same blend of wonder and fear that Miller and Nye were talking about with the technological sublime. I want to emphasize here that obviously AI is not really deciding or thinking, not yet at least, but it's rather using algorithms and large databases to mimic humans' behavior, to mimic thinking, and to mimic decision. However, if we go back to the technological sublime, and Nye especially, he was cautioning that the nature of technological sublime, in a sense, is a non-renewable resource, right? The buzz term these days. It wears off. And society, in a way, must keep finding new subjects of awe, right? So if you look at AI with this idea, with this lens, this raises, I believe, important questions. What's going to happen when the novelty of AI wears off? How are we going to manage the societal impacts of AI once it becomes just another tool in our technological arsenal? And maybe even more important, how do we ensure that in our pursuit of the sublime, we don't lose sight of human values that should guide the development and deployment of these technologies ultimately? I think that if we apply that lens of technological sublime to AI, we're not just acknowledging the power and the potential of these technologies, but we're also, in a way, looking at recognizing the need for a balanced approach that marries, that combines technological innovation on one hand with ethical considerations and human-centered design. I think that this balance here is key if we want AI, like all the technologies that came before AI, to serve as a force for good in society rather than becoming the source of division or disenchantment. We definitely don't need that, especially these days, any day.
That's right. But I appreciate what you're saying. And at the same time, I'm thinking about how understanding both what is possible and what we should be concerned with. In my mind, you can really only get that if you immerse yourself with trying some of these tools out and seeing it. Like the analogy that I make all the time is the hammer can be a tool for good and a tool of destruction, but it's the people that have had lots of practice applying the hammer in different contexts who get that. And I really appreciate what you mentioned about understanding that our relationship with technology also has impact on how we relate with one another. And I think it's really a good exercise with students to even just look at some of the marketing around the technology and how they're presenting it and how they want us to have this sense of awe. And I think sometimes even if we are fearful of technology, even that kind of benefits the people that are making the money behind some of these products, because to claim that it is all powerful, I think also makes it appealing in a certain way. I'm not sure. In one of the tools you brought up, the friendship thing, and we're seeing this all the time and have been seeing it. I'll often point people to Replica AI to look at, and the marketing of that technology is quite fascinating. It really brands itself as a companion who's there with you. I think the exact phrase is something like always on your side. And as you said, that's complicated because of course we always need companionship to the extent that we really want to label this companionship. That's a lengthy conversation. But then also, Dr. Fornaciari, if any of us had a friend who never ever disagreed with us, I'm not sure that's actually, to play with the word, a generative relationship. Sometimes our friends that push back and argue with us, those are really the friends who help us grow. I wonder if there's that marketing language around any other tools. Does that help us really think about the lens of the technological sublime? If there's a teacher who's thinking, yeah, let's do a close reading of a different company's branding. Is that an exercise that maybe connects with what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. The way in which narratives and frames develop obviously influence how we understand tools and how we understand reality in general. Framing these technologies in a certain way obviously puts something in the picture, tells us what's important and what should be in the picture, and tells us what's not important and what should not be in the picture, right? So if we think about privacy, for instance, it's not that there is a huge focus on privacy, on the sensational conversations that we have in advertisement, especially around AI. And so that may prime us to think that privacy is not that important because it's not part of the conversation. So I've done a lot of research around privacy since I was working on my dissertation, so like more than 10 years ago now. And I've seen it with other technologies as well, that the conversation around privacy has often stayed out of the picture or has focused on certain components that may influence the audience to think about those technologies and the possibilities of those technologies in a certain way or another. So if we think about social media, there was not really an option for us whether we could either be part of the social media platform and have friends and have access to sociality, have access to the ability to share and et cetera, all these benefits. And we were giving away our privacy, right? But the privacy part there was not emphasized that much because it was not really a choice. Our choice was either to be social and give away our data or to keep our data and not have any friends. I'm exaggerating, but it's often that case. And how these big corporations prime us to think about certain aspects of the technology cause us to see what's important and what's not. Even some things may be really important, even when they're not emphasized.
I wonder, since you've done so much work in that realm, I know it's unfair to ask you to do any kind of future forecasting, but I think In this stage that we're in, where we are seeing change at such a rapid rate, I think it can be useful to just say, looking at where we're at now, where are we going? Because I almost wonder if the privacy issue, as you mentioned, and social media to a certain extent for some adults and young adults who are entering into the workforce, it's to your detriment if you don't have some kind of social media presence. But I think about other tools that also have access to aspects of our data. I've done a lot of research into the Netflix recommender algorithm. And if you're a Netflix subscriber, they have all of your viewing data and preferences, and you can't opt out of that. And I'm almost wondering, do you think we're going to get to a future where, almost in the same way that cigarettes or alcohol have advisory labels on them, letting people know of some of the cautions, I wonder if some of these tools, will we get to a place maybe where we're going to want to make it, as you said, sometimes the marketing or the user experience doesn't highlight that privacy point. But do you feel like, are we getting to a tipping point? Do you think things are going to have to course correct with that? Do you have any thoughts on, just even a few years from now, how we might be thinking about privacy differently?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we're going to ask for more protection and we're going to ask for more transparency in how data are used, and we're going to ask for more options. That would be amazing. I mean, if we compare with the European Union in 2019, they had a very important data protection law came about, like a framework that gave directions to all the states, to all the countries in the EU to protect user data and put that at the forefront, right? I'm hoping that is a good sign and that maybe the United States might follow eventually, because there is the big problem is that technological advancement is so fast that the laws are not able to catch up often. So we're still talking about laws around social media in a way, and we have AI now it's been knocking at the door for a while. I think that it's a very important time for especially higher education to emphasize, to put an emphasis on ethical use and ethical development. I would love to have those care disclaimer like they do in cigarettes and etc. I don't know whether that's going to happen soon, but I'm hoping that there's going to be more and more focus on ethics and literacy and understanding how these tools work, understanding our rights, understanding how much power the data that we put in has for big corporations, because that's also part of the picture. It's not a fair trade-off, right? We cannot decide whether we're going to use ChatGPT or not in a way, because everyone else is going to be using it. We have to be part of the environment, like Facebook. Everybody was using it. It's not a fair choice to decide not to be part of it just because I cannot choose my privacy setting. I have to either opt in or opt out in many of these technologies. I think that we need to keep pushing back and we need to keep emphasizing the importance of ethical training, both for users, but even more so for developers. And we need to hold on to our data as much as we can.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're reminding me of this idea that I keep sort of hearing every once in a while, that really we're in an era where, ironically, it's things like philosophy and ethics. They're going to be so much more important now than ever before.
Thank you for tuning in to Shifting Schools. Let's pause our discussion to spotlight Libra HQ, a breakthrough in using AI to deepen connections within organizations. Imagine an environment where every staff member feels truly seen and valued. This is the heart of Libra's mission. Libra transforms how leaders celebrate and recognize the personal and professional milestones of their team members. It's not just about reminders. Libra's AI dives deeper, offering insight into enhanced team cohesion and promote a culture where support and acknowledgement are paramount. Picture a school where every individual is acknowledged, from work achievements to personal victories, creating a culture of appreciation in just minutes a day. In these challenging times, Where the demands on educators have never been higher, Libra offers a way for school leaders to lead with true empathy and compassion, ensuring every team member feels an integral part of their community's success. Discover how Libra can revolutionize your school's culture. For a demo, contact me at jeff@shiftingschools.com. Let's build a future where every educator and staff member feels connected and valued. And now, let's get back to our conversation.
You have me thinking about, for our K-12 educators, the very real opportunity there is to do some relevant educational experiences around what does it mean for us to advocate. Something that I try to do very often is when you're using a tool, how easy is it for you to navigate your way towards a feedback page? Is there a way for you to contact with any of the generative AI tools that are creating something that you maybe think is harmful or biased? How quickly can you let those folks know? And it's a really interesting activity. And I'm wondering, Dr. Fornaciari, if you just want to underscore, because I hear this said sometimes, and this idea, and of course it's a privileged kind of stance to say, I don't need to worry about my privacy or my data. Of course, there are certain people who need to be worried about it in other ways, but I'm wondering if you can just underscore when you're talking about why it is so critical that we have some autonomy and agency over who gets access to our data. Can you give a few examples of this? Because I know that I've read things like even the data that Amazon would have on the average consumer, that when they can break that down, there's very real world situations that they are able to predict things like divorce, things like bankruptcy based on your shopping habits. And that's I know that sounds like science fiction, but can you say more about this idea of why our privacy and why our data agency is so critical?
Yeah, that's another great question. And we don't think about it until something goes wrong, because we all do enjoy the algorithm when it goes well, right? We enjoy being recommended the right movie. We enjoy being recommended the right thing to purchase, et cetera, et cetera. But then there are things like, for instance, price discrimination, or maybe if I search for a certain flight or a certain destination on the same computer over and over, and they collect my data and they realize that I am very willing to want to travel to Italy because I have family in Italy. And so perhaps, not perhaps, but price discrimination is like a collection of data and a change of the price of the same ticket based on how willing they think, or the algorithm thinks, I will be to pay a certain price for a certain destination, right? So it can even just be like $50 or $100 difference, if you will. It's not going to be huge, not big enough for me to investigate that, right? So there is that blurry line of when is it convenient? Am I going to go all the way into exploring the discrimination and proving it? But you can imagine how much money corporations can do around something like that. Another example that comes to mind is probably 10 years ago already now. There was a lawsuit against Target because this teenage girl who was living with her dad started receiving coupons from Target for diapers and baby food. She was, I believe, 14 or 15 at the time. So the dad sued Target to later find out that the daughter was pregnant. And Target had been collecting data about her purchasing behavior, and the algorithm figured out that perhaps she was having a baby. And so they started sending her coupons, right? Had she been 25, she would have enjoyed the coupons, but you see obviously the violation there. So that has to do with the laws not being fast enough to catch up with what's possible, and the corporations taking advantage in a way of that Wild West when that happens. If we think about AI, we are in the Wild West now because it's so new and people don't understand the potential of what's happening to the data that we write in the conversation. And that's even more problematic if we add the layer of intimacy that many of us have developed with ChatGPT or other large language models. we feel like we're having a conversation with a friend. We're not primed to think about our privacy when we have that conversation, right? So we may be sharing information that we wouldn't share otherwise. Have we read the terms of use of ChatGPT? Has anyone done it? Probably not. Not many of us.
The ironic thing with that is the TOS, the terms of service, I actually, because of generative AI, I've been playing around with downloading and uploading it and having a resource like ChatGPT flag, give me the 8 ethical questions that I should be thinking about that are here. So it's been like a renaissance of interest into some of the legalese, tough to read information in a way. But I think those real world examples that you pointed to are really great. And I think, again, this is where some of that like science fictional thinking about like, where does this go eventually can be really useful. I often point folks to Amy Webb, the futurist, who does this great annual huge report on the future state of technology. And inside the report, there's always these scenarios. And one of the predicted scenarios that she has, what you were talking about with the changing algorithm, knowing like where you might go for your price point on your flight. She talks about, do we get to a point with our grocery shopping where it's all personalized, it's all fluctuating, the prices of everything all the time, nothing is standardized, because they would know that information a little bit in terms of what you really need and what you can afford. So again, I think your point about building the awareness around the capabilities is just so critical so that we can have some influence and we can advocate for the laws we need. Dr. Fornaciari, you've spoken so much about deepfakes, what they mean for our ability to trust the media, and you talked about literacy being so critical, media literacy especially. And I would say in this new-ish era of synthetic media, the time really is now for us to be leaning into media literacy. What are some of the questions that you're interested in exploring when it comes to deepfakes? Or what's a question that you would love to see folks thinking a little bit more about?
Oh, that's another great question. I hope you have a few minutes. But yeah, when it comes to deepfakes, I think one of the first questions I'm deeply interested in is how do we effectively educate the public to recognize these synthetic media and to understand the implications behind those? The challenge, I believe, is not just about awareness anymore. It's about developing a multifaceted approach that can keep up with the rapid evolution of these technologies. Fakes are becoming so sophisticated that traditional media literacy tools are not enough anymore. So I'm really curious about what new strategies we can develop to ensure that people are not just aware, but also equipped to identify and critically evaluate the media that they encounter. So critical thinking in particular, we've talked about critical thinking forever, if you will, but that needs to be at the core of media literacy programs. So in my courses, I always encourage students to question the source, to question the context, to explore the plausibility of what they're seeing and hearing when it comes to information. But I would also want to emphasize, and it's even more important, that we need to tell people to question the information that we believe in, not just the information that's so sensational that it's obviously suspicious, but the information that we believe in and the information that comes from sources that we typically trust. Because that information that we believe in and that comes from sources that we trust can be the sneakiest, because it's the one that we tend to scrutinize or question the least, right? So imagine that you're scrolling through your social media feed and come across a video clip shared by either a close friend or a reputable news outlet that you trust, and maybe that video shows a well-known politician. This is perfect timing, that can make a shocking statement during a press conference. It's coming from a source that you trust. Perhaps it aligns with some of your pre-existing beliefs. So you just believe it, right? You don't question its authenticity. You're like, you saw it, it confirms your belief is true, right? However, this is exactly when we should pause and apply critical thinking, right? especially in the time of deepfakes, videos that we traditionally consider strong evidence of truth cannot be taken at face value. So we have to always evaluate what we are consuming, whether it comes from a source that we don't trust, and even more so when it comes from a source that we trust. We need to examine the source, obviously, but also examine the content, cross-check other information and other sources, perhaps seek expert verification. There are several steps that we can take to discover that video, whether that video was a deep fake or not, right? It's not really about fostering distrust, right? That's not what we are trying to do. We're not trying to encourage distrusting the media, but it's about cultivating a healthy skepticism where people feel confident in assessing the authenticity of the content that they consume. And I think we can get this done. But what concerns me even more here is that the broader consequences that deepfake and synthetic media can have. We can definitely develop critical thinking and literacy to detect deepfakes. We can develop these skills, but this is not out of reach. But what we should be thinking about too is what I find very problematic is the long-term impact that deepfakes can have on public trust in our media and in our political system. As these media become more prevalent, there's a risk that people might start to doubt everything they see or hear. What happens then to the public discourse if we can no longer distinguish between real and fake? Or at least when we end up spending so much time sorting what is true from what is fake and talking about the sensational aspects of deepfakes, that we shift our focus away from what matters. It's not just the problem of understanding what's fake or what's not, is that we are focusing so much on what's fake that we forget to think about what's true, right? So I think it's important to ask ourselves that we need to find a way to ensure that this erosion of trust doesn't lead into a widespread criticism, cynicism, or disengagement from the media and from the political system. How do we do that? It's a really good question that I'm looking at and that we should all be focusing on. It could have profound implications, not just for fields like journalism or for the legal system, which rely heavily, obviously, on credible visual and auditory evidence, but also for democratic processes and societal cohesion. So that's a big one for sure. If we,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering too, just like with privacy, you were mentioning it's useful to look at the EU and what they've done. And I'm wondering where, again, we can foster that curiosity and see where are some places that are on the right path. Because certainly if we're looking at a US focus, you also have a media system that is not very well publicly funded, right? So it's a model that it's like they need to generate lots of engagement and lots of clicks. So that's where something like sensational headlines or fear mongering, this is that interdisciplinary thinking, right? Understanding human psychology is understanding why certain things will be framed in a certain way. And when I think even just think about the pandemic and science communication, we've got a very practical example for, as you were saying, if it's a low trust environment, there's real harm. Is there a model or is there an example that you're thinking we can point students towards where this country or this organization is doing a really good job of maybe building up that trust so there is a healthier attitude towards, I know where I can go for reliable information, or I know that this source is not necessarily going to try to, we're talking about deep fakes, but I think it's not going to try and use some of those deep moves to just get lots of clicks. Do you have any thoughts on that? This is a place for us to look where maybe there's some hope. Maybe they're getting it right.
That's a really good question. I think we can look at some think tanks, we can look at some independent investigative journalists, we can look at some freedom fighter groups, mostly organizations that are outlets that come out of nonprofit organizations that are not trying to make a profit out of their outlet or the information that they spread, but rather that are trying to work for the public good. Looking at sources that are not, there are independent sources and they are trying to make the world a better place. We're not necessarily looking at the traditional outlets or places like, I was thinking, I was working at a project for looking at media discourse around the role of women in Afghanistan and the role of women in peace building in Afghanistan. And I came across a really good blog written by some women that had left Afghanistan and are hiding and writing from their hiding spots about what was happening when they were still in Afghanistan when the Taliban were getting ready to come back into power. I want to say that was I can't remember the name of that, but it was like a freedom fighter type of blog organizations that were sharing information. If we look at outlets that are not for profit and that have journalists or bloggers that are really looking to share the information that they gather without trying to make money out of that, that's where we should look at. We can still look, obviously, at the traditional outlets, but also have smaller outlets, local outlets, or outlets that may have to do with think tanks or with nonprofit platforms that may be providing information in a less skewed way and less sensational way as well.
Yeah, and you have me thinking, just as I'm speaking to you right now, I stumbled upon your work. I invited you to have a conversation. I'm thinking, especially for some of those smaller outlets or local journalism outlets, for classes to invite somebody in to speak to how they do their work, because I think that's the other critical piece for students to be aware of is there are standards for journalism.
Mhm.
So how do people actually go through them can be an interesting lesson, even for very young students too. And correct me if I have this wrong, but I believe you've also done some work with children's literature. And for a picture book author who's depicting nonfiction story, they have a fact checker. So I feel like even looking at a medium like that, where I don't think children's lit and fact checker automatically, but that wanting to get the story correct in that medium is again another reminder of there are great standards. There are people who are doing this work. Let students learn more about that process, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Like thinking about the ethical guidelines of how things should be done and having always the greater good before profit in mind, right? So just trying to make the world a better place in a way and understanding also because sometimes or even oftentimes journalists, they are just trying to make a living and if they haven't been properly trained to think about the ethical implications of the information that they share, they may just, some of them share it without thinking of the power and consequences that their amplified voice based on the outlet that they're working for may have, and what may be the consequences for society, right? For the public discourse and for the narratives that become part of the conversation, right? So there is a need for sure to train journalists and students who may become journalists or bloggers or influencers to understand the consequences of their words based on the authority that they have or the authority that the media they're working for, the outlet they're working for, gives them. Because we're not often trained, unfortunately, to think about the broader picture and to think about the consequences, the long-term consequences that what we share may have. I'm writing a clickbait title. It's going to give me a lot of reads and I'm going to get a promotion or like a bonus. You don't think about the broader consequences sometimes if you're not trained to think about the broader consequences. We like to think that all journalists have had the opportunity to go through those trainings, but not everyone has.
No, and it's also, I find that idea of being really intentional in thinking through an ethical dilemma. Those kind of things are very nuanced, complex. You need a lot of time to process and consider other potential futures. And it's a little bit ironic, but I have found actually an interesting way. I love using ethical dilemma scenarios with students. It can be really impactful, but also as a teacher, it takes a lot of time to draft the whole thing up. So I actually have been using generative AI to formulate some of them. And you have me thinking as an Italian about the example. This is going back years back. I love the author Elena Ferrante's work. Now, Elena Ferrante is not the real author's name. They wanted to write under a pseudonym to have the protection of just living their life anonymously, even though they were world famous author. And there was a reporter who did find their real identity. And with a literature class I was talking about, we had a great conversation around to what extent, if you're earning your living because you are an author who's putting work out into the world, do you still have the right to anonymity? Should that reporter have done that or not? But I wonder if, because ethics have been so important to this conversation, if there are other thoughts you have on either specific dilemmas relevant to AI or just specific ways of exploring ethical dilemmas. Because I'm going to pat myself on the back here for one moment. One thing that's always been important to me is in developing those scenarios, what I'll often do is break up the class and give the class specific roles. And I do like a time release feed drop of updates to the scenarios. Does that shift your thinking or not now that you've got this piece of information? Because context matters, right? So for educators who are thinking, I'm hearing you, we need like a renaissance of an ethics-based education. What are some ways that we can get our students really excited about ethics, or even their parents and caretakers to understand, really having a grounding or getting to rehearse some of the critical thinking skills that let us explore ethics? Do you have thoughts on great ways to do that?
First of all, I like to emphasize obviously the importance of ethics in so many directions. If we think about ChatGPT, for instance, it's great. Like, we are using it, we are getting all the information we want out of it. Without I have to write a paper, let me put the prompt in there, I get all the information I need, I can copy and paste it in my paper, turn it in, and I'm done with my day. So the implications, there are so many. I don't know where the information that where ChatGPT is getting the information from, right? So one thing that I could question there is who wrote that information. Of course, ChatGPT rearranged it, but am I plagiarizing some author that doesn't even know that his content or her content has been used in that database? Am I infringing their copyright, someone's copyright? Are those even real sources that are used? So there's that component, right? I'm taking advantage of someone else's work, perhaps without quoting it or citing it properly, perhaps without consent, very likely without consent. So that's one thing that I should be wondering about. Another thing that I can think about that maybe I'm not primed to think about when I do that action, then I get an essay that may have a lot of biased information in it, right? Because ChatGPT, again, as I was saying earlier, is not thinking, or like other large language models are not thinking or are not creating. They are getting information from a database, rearranging it, writing it in a similar yet different way, and vomiting it for us. In a way that's very pleasant and can be very useful. But what ChatGPT does and other large language models, they are in a way perpetrating what's out there in society, right? Or on that database that they're using. So if that database was a perfect society, then the outcome would be a great neutral outcome. But that database grabs information from an already stereotypical, bias-oriented, perhaps. It could be a conversation that has bias, that has stereotypes, that has all kinds of components that are just amplified. So if we look at society, there are so many faults, right? So there are so many shortcomings. ChatGPT and other large language models risk perpetuating and amplifying those faults, right? If we use that generative AI, we can certainly, we're all loving this technology, but we have to understand the implications that this technology has. We have to understand that what is the outcome of that technology still has to go through a lot of scrutiny from us as humans to make sure that the information that we are or that the essay that we are creating and developing, or the piece of whatever we're writing, or the speech that we're putting together is not biased, is not plagiarizing, is being transparent about the information that it's sharing. It's based on real data and not fake data. We're talking about deep fakes and all the sensational conversation around deep fakes. We're feeding large language models with deep fakes. They are not trained to understand whether something is real or not. They're not trained to understand sarcasm. So they may get information from The Onion or another comical or sarcastic outlet and bring it in at face value and pretend it's true. So there is a lot of sorting through that we have to do. And ethics here has a huge role in understanding all these components. So I think that making sure that students and practitioners too understand all these implications when they're using generative AI and other technologies may help them understand the importance of ethics and the importance of scrutiny and the importance of checking for all these other components that we may not, again, be primed to thinking about when we use it.
Yeah, something that I'm hopeful for. I think it's been a long time, actually, that we've become very lax about having that critical skepticism that you mentioned about what we consume. And I think this is a tipping point that's really going to force us to almost read, analyze, slow down, which is hard to do in an information landscape that's 24/7 news. But we need it.
Educators, are you searching for a new space to connect, collaborate, and grow? Well, Camp Shifting Schools is your new home. With the decline of X, formerly Twitter, we're here to offer a safe, welcoming community where you can join other passionate teachers. Take part in free courses, webinars, and live AMA sessions to evaluate your practice. Ready to join the conversation? Head over to camp.shiftingschools.com and become part of the camp community today. Learning and connecting awaits.
We've been talking about throughout this conversation, when you immerse yourself in this technology, you understand, as you articulated, these are the things we need to be concerned with. And at the same time, you also are able to see the potential. You've written that you think AI can support students in, quote, profoundly human communication. And I feel like this is a great question for us to wrap on. Where do you see the future of communication studies going with AI? And do you want to touch upon more what you mean by generating profoundly human communication?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very important topic of conversation that we have to focus on as well. Obviously, these days are becoming both incredibly exciting and also a bit complex for communication, the field of communication. We are entering a new era, if you will, where artificial intelligence is not just a tool that we use, but more of an interactive partner in the creative and communicative process. So we need to understand how to make that happen. So where do I see these things going? There are a few directions that I think are important. So first, I'd like to talk about the human AI collaboration in communication. Generative AI in particular has the incredible potential to process and analyze vast amount of data. So obviously, with many shortcomings that we've been talking about, we need to keep in mind again about the potential bias in the data, the lack of contextual understanding that the language model has, the inability to grasp deeper emotional nuances that only humans can bring to communication. This is where I think the human touch comes into place, right? So a collaboration between humans and AI, I think, can help us uncover insights about what resonates with an audience or identify the emotional triggers that might be effective. I think it's important to remember that AI's strength lies in its analytical power, right? Not in its creativity, not in its empathy, or at least not yet. We'll see where the future takes us. But generative AI can provide us with valuable suggestions or strategies based on the patterns that it detects in the data. But it is up to us as humans to interpret the insights, to bring them to life with our own creativity, with our own voice, with our own empathy and ethical judgment. That's not in the algorithm, right? So I believe that the real magic here happens when we take those AI generated insights or information and infuse them with our own unique human touch. The nuances, the authentic voice, the ethical considerations that make communication truly meaningful. As we look to the future, I think it's essential that students and practitioners, for that matter, even more, collaborate with AI. Don't just use it instead of their brain, right? It has to be a collaboration. They have to ensure that they retain control over the final message. And they have to make sure it connects on a deeply human level, right? So that's what we need to think about when it comes to AI and human connection. Along those lines, we can also talk about artificial intelligence enhanced personalization and audience engagement. We were talking about that in a way earlier. This isn't entirely new. Algorithms have been driving targeted advertising as similar phenomenon for a while. But what's different now is that this hyper personalization is becoming widely available to the public, right? So not just to large corporation. Generative AI can now analyze and predict audience behavior on unprecedented scales. And that can lead to personalized communication strategies that can make messages more effective and engaging. But again, we need to keep in mind that this increased accessibility comes with new challenges. We were talking about privacy. We're talking about the potential for manipulation. With the fact that generative AI is so available to the everyday user and everyday practitioner and everyday students, we have to understand the incredible power that comes with. As communication studies evolve, it will be more and more important to explore how we can navigate the challenges that these bring about, ensuring that while we make communication more personalized through the algorithm, but we also need to remain vigilant about not crossing the ethical lines and making sure that we're not perpetuating stereotypes, we're not perpetuating bias, and that we are infusing our own human touch into the conversation. We've been talking about ethics, obviously ethical communication in the age of generative AI, I think and hope is going to bring about some tricky question to the forefront. We'll need to address, we talked about privacy, we need to address consent, we need to address the potential biases that can creep into AI generated content. So the future of communication studies, I think, can need to see a strong focus, even stronger than it already is, on ethics with courses that are dedicated into figuring out how we can use AI in ways that are transparent, ways that are fair, ways that are respectful to people's rights, also infusing it with humanity, because that preserving the human element in AI-driven communication is key. No matter how sophisticated AI can get, the essence of communication is deeply human. The future of communication studies, I think, will emphasize maintaining that human connection, ensuring that our communication remains empathetic, it remains culturally sensitive, and again, grounded in ethical principles. And storytelling, which is one of the most powerful forms of communication, will obviously keep being a central focus. We'll probably be exploring how AI can support creation of narratives that resonate emotionally with audiences while staying authentic and original. But we have to keep being on the driver's seat. We have to preserve the core human element that make communication meaningful, I think, and that we have to keep infusing our humanity into technology in a way that will make this advancement, this technological advancement, truly impactful. And we don't just want these tools to enhance our capabilities, our reach, our ability to create more content, but we also want to keep deepening our connection with one another. We were saying at the beginning of this conversation that new technologies also influence how we interact with one another and how we perceive one another, etc. So this is very important today to keep in mind that the technology is there and it's a tool. It's not good or bad in itself. It's a tool that can help us be more productive or what have you. But we need to keep our humanity there, because there's nothing like the human voice, you know?
I feel like what you're talking about in saying that this moment with generative AI and communication, making the human more important, it's similar to with the rise of the smartphone, those in-person connections when people have the phone away have become like more important, or it feels very special now. So it's going to be very interesting to see where that goes. Just in closing, you as a researcher have a skill set that goes way beyond mine. And I'm wondering if you can just tell us, what is a story or an area that you've got your eyes on this year specifically that you think, again, speaks to these issues that you were mentioning? Because not being the researcher that you are, something that I've been trying my best to follow is seeing which media outlets are coming out with their AI statement and are being transparent in terms of how reporters are using AI. It was interesting to see how the Paris Olympics were using AI. Is there any other kind of area that the researcher in you is very curious about and you're going to be following super closely this year?
Yeah, I've always been very fascinated by how the media talk about technology and what they bring to the forefront and what they hide or forget to talk about. Let's put it a different way. So I'm really interested in seeing what are going to be the focusing points for media conversations in terms of AI. Are they going to emphasize the importance of ethics? Are they going to emphasize the need for privacy? Are they going to not talk about any of these? And are they just going to emphasize the fantastic opportunities that we have with new technologies? So I'm really interested in seeing what media frames will come about in relation to these new technology. I've explored media frames in relationship to the evolution of technologies for a century, going back to when the telegraph came about, how they were talking about the consequences for society brought about by telegraph. And even back then, they were saying with the telegraph, privacy is dead, so you should stop thinking about it. So that's a frame that's been around for more than a century. So I'm very interested to see what are going to be conversations that the media try to bring to the forefront, and what are they emphasizing and what are they not emphasizing, what are they bringing into the picture and how. So that's going to be my focus.
Oh, fascinating. I hope that you've got something that you're going to publish on that, because you have me curious now. You're right. Like, we've seen so many new technologies, and I wonder, I know it's an oversimplification, is the mass media in general optimistic or pessimistic about new technologies? My gut reaction would be to say pessimistic, because when you were saying opportunities, I find there's a few podcasts I follow that they specifically do look at the opportunities. But when I'm just speaking anecdotally with friends or neighbors, a lot of those stories are so lesser known. So sometimes I feel like I'm fascinated by the potential AI has right now to help us decode animal interspecies communication. Like, absolutely fascinated. And whenever I'm boring my neighbors with that story, they're, what are you talking about? I've never heard of that. Do you feel like there's been a general theme in tone in the way the media covers technology, or is that too simple of a question to respond to?
No, that's a fascinating question. And that's definitely, if we go back to thinking about the emphasis on what's sensational, bad news are way more interesting than good news, right? So I think that's part of the reason why the media often emphasize the risks, or the society is never going to be the same and we're all doomed, right? So there is a lot of that has to do with the sensational aspect of trying to sell stories and trying to tell stories as well. There is also that, if we want to go back to the idea of technological sublime, framing new technology with the lens of technological sublime is something like emphasizing the fear, emphasizing the deep lack of understanding. We don't know what's going to happen to human labor. We don't know what's going to happen to our creativity, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we need to be aware of the possible negative, of all the negative implications that these technologies can bring about, but it's also safe and sane to be excited about all the opportunities. And you're right, there's not many people that emphasize the opportunities. There's a lot of focus on the plagiarism, and these technologies are just going to be the end of higher education. We're not going to, when the internet came about, when search engines came about, in higher ed, many had the same reaction. We are all going to be cheating. We're all going to be plagiarizing. There's no meaning in trying to get students to study anymore. And I don't believe that's true, because students, like, people are trying to, for the most part, work for the good. Students are in school because they're trying to learn. They are not in school because they want to plagiarize. So I think that there is going to be students who plagiarize. There is going to be students who use it instead of their brain. But I think that students and practitioners and everybody is thirsty to understand how they can use these technology to make their life better, and to make the product of what they do better, and to help them grow rather than just sit and wait for the technology to do it for them.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's been research that's come out that has said the rate at which there is cheating hasn't shifted. And I think, just as you were saying, we need healthy skepticism, I feel like I also hear you saying we also need some healthy optimism. So thank you so much, Professor, for bringing us a dose of both of those things. It was a great honor to speak with you and to talk more about the important work that you do. So thank you for lending your voice and your expertise to us today.
Thank you, Tricia, for having me. It's been a great conversation. I've had a lot of fun chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey there, dedicated listener. If you've made it this far, we know you're passionate about shifting the way education works, and Tricia and I appreciate you. If you loved what you heard today, we'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to rate and review Shifting Schools wherever you listen to podcasts. Those ratings help us reach even more educators just like you. And if you know someone who could benefit from these conversations, please share this episode with them. Just one person, think of the impact we can make together. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter for even more great content. And if you haven't already, join us at Camp Shifting Schools, where the conversations keep going long after the podcasts end. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and thank you for being part of Shifting Schools.